I was 61 when I married Janet. I'd been retired just under a year, and I remember thinking, maybe for the first time in my life, that I had finally earned the right to rest. 43 years as a structural engineer, blueprints, city contracts, late nights, skipped vacations, the whole 9 yards. I'd given my youth to buildings and my middle age to a marriage that dissolved the day my first wife told me she was tired of waiting for me to come home. I didn't blame her. She was right. But I'd always thought the second act of my life would be quieter, warmer, maybe even redemptive. Janet came along at just the right moment. Widow, early 50s, quick smile, kind voice, and, at least on paper, just looking for someone who wanted peace as much as she did. She had a 17-year-old daughter from her previous marriage, and I won't lie, that gave me pause. But I told myself I could handle it. I told myself that love was enough to bridge the gap. And if love didn't do it, then surely consistency and generosity would. Her name was Renee. She was the kind of teenager who knew exactly how to take the temperature of a room and adjust her behavior accordingly, polite in public, dismissive in private. She'd smile through her teeth at dinner, then slam her door behind her the second she got upstairs. I wasn't stupid. I knew she resented me. I knew she didn't want a new dad, but I thought I could win her over by showing up. I paid for her driving lessons, bought her a used Jetta just so she wouldn't feel left out among her friends. I covered her tuition when she suddenly decided she wanted to go to a private college across state lines. Every time Janet mentioned how grateful she was for everything I was doing, I'd pretend it felt good to hear, even though the gratitude never came from Renee. I wanted so badly to believe I was finally part of a family again that I ignored the obvious signs, the cold stares, the way she'd roll her eyes when I offered to help, the way she never, not once, said thank you. Still, I told myself to be patient. I'd grown up in a house where silence was normal and affection was rare. Maybe she was just guarded. Maybe she'd open up, eventually. But the truth is, it wasn't just Renee who was cold. Janet had a way of deflecting whenever I brought up anything uncomfortable. If I mentioned how dismissive Renee had been, she'd change the subject. If I said I felt like an outsider in my own home, she'd pat my knee and say, "Oh, don't be silly. We love having you here." But it never felt like love. It felt like usefulness. Like I was a fixture in the house, a reliable source of funding and logistical support. There were no fights, no screaming matches, nothing dramatic. Just a quiet, creeping sense that I was being tolerated, not valued. But by then, I'd already signed the marriage license, already put her name on the joint account, already started paying for things I'd never even agreed to. Renee's new iPhone, a surprise spa weekend for the girls, some interior designer hired to repaint the downstairs even though I thought the walls were fine the way they were. The money went, and so did the respect. I think what stung the most wasn't just the lack of appreciation, it was the feeling that I was a guest in my own retirement. I had spent 4 decades saving, investing, delaying gratification, all for this mythical chapter of life where things would finally slow down. But instead of enjoying a quiet morning coffee on the porch, I was fielding text messages from Renee asking for money, driving Janet to overpriced brunches with her friends, and sitting through family dinners where I barely spoke unless it was to offer to pay. I started keeping track, just mentally at first, of how many times I was thanked versus how many times I was expected to hand something over. The ratio was staggering. I tried to talk to Janet about it one night, gently. I said, "I just feel like maybe I'm not seen as part of the family, more like a sponsor." She laughed, not cruelly, just like it was the most absurd thing she'd ever heard. "You're being too sensitive," she said. "You knew what you were getting into." And maybe I did. Maybe I wanted the dream of a family so badly, I ignored all the red flags waving right in front of my face. Still, I hung on longer than I should have. There's something stubborn in men like me. Men who spent their whole lives fixing problems, finding solutions, holding beams in place so things don't collapse. I kept thinking I could build something out of this, that if I just held on tight enough, long enough, maybe the pieces would come together. But there's no blueprint for being used. No structural fix for emotional detachment. I started withdrawing, not just from them, but from myself. I stopped reading in the evenings. I stopped going for my morning walks. I felt more like a landlord than a husband, more like a benefactor than a stepfather. But still I paid. Still I showed up. Still I smiled. Until the day it all came undone with a single sentence. But that's another chapter. That first year of marriage was like watching a house being slowly overtaken by termites. From the outside, everything looked fine. Inside, the foundation was rotting. I kept telling myself I was imagining it, that things would get better once Renee went to college, once Janet adjusted to our new life. But time didn't fix anything. It just deepened the cracks. And still I told myself to wait, to be patient. Because isn't that what love does? It waits. It sacrifices. It forgives. But what no one tells you is that sometimes love is just another word for denial. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, of all days. I remember that because I'd just come back from the DMV, spent 2 hours waiting to renew a car registration for Renee's Jetta, the one I bought her just 8 months prior. She hadn't bothered to go herself, of course. Too busy with school, Janet had said. But that school was more often bottomless brunches and influencer-style outings than midterms and essays. The kind of lifestyle that runs high on expectations and low on accountability. I walked through the door holding the fresh registration papers and a bag of takeout from her favorite Thai place. Because yes, even then, I was still trying to keep the peace. I was met with the sound of her voice echoing from the kitchen, sharp and entitled, like she owned the place. She was arguing with Janet about her credit card being declined at some boutique across town. What do you mean it bounced? I had like $300 left on it this morning, she shrieked, not even acknowledging me as I stepped inside. I stood there for a second, watching the two of them. Janet looked flustered, eyes darting to me as if hoping I wouldn't say anything. But I did. I walked in and calmly placed the envelope with the DMV papers on the counter and said, I had to cover the property taxes on the house this morning. That's where the money went. The account was getting dangerously low. Renee scoffed, like I'd just told her the Wi-Fi was down. Okay. And you couldn't wait a day? I needed that money for something important. Her voice was laced with that smug, bratty tone she used when she wanted to put me in my place. But I didn't rise to it. I just looked at her, really looked at her, and said, Renee, you've been using that card like it's your personal piggy bank. I've asked you before to check in with me before you make large purchases. That's when it came. She didn't even blink. She just rolled her eyes and muttered under her breath, but loud enough for both of us to hear, You're not my dad. You're just a temporary ATM my mom married. I stood frozen for a moment, the sentence hanging in the air like a slap across the face. It wasn't even the words, not really. It was the way she said them. So casual, so dismissive, like it wasn't a big deal to reduce me to a walking dollar sign. I looked at Janet, hoping, needing, her to say something. Anything. I needed her to push back, to say that wasn't true, that she wouldn't tolerate that kind of disrespect under her roof. But she didn't. She looked down, fiddled with her phone, and said nothing. The silence felt like betrayal. I don't know what came over me in that moment, but something in me snapped. Not loudly. Not the kind of snap that comes with yelling or throwing things. No, this was quieter, colder. I took the envelope with the registration back off the counter and said, You can go to the DMV yourself tomorrow. Then I walked into the study, pulled out the laptop, and started making changes. I canceled the credit card. I removed Renee from the car insurance policy. I disabled the gas card, the Amazon auto orders, the school tuition autopay, everything. And then I sat down at the kitchen table with Janet and said something I never imagined I'd have to say. You need to choose. Her or me. I won't keep financing my own disrespect. Janet blinked like she didn't understand the question. What do you mean, choose? That's my daughter. I nodded. And I'm your husband. Or at least I thought I was. But if your daughter sees me as nothing more than an ATM, and you're not willing to correct that, then we've got nothing left to talk about. She stared at me like I'd just threatened to burn the house down. You're being dramatic, she said, which only made it worse. That word, dramatic, was what people use when they want to invalidate your pain without addressing the root of it. I wasn't being dramatic. I was being clear. For the first time in years, I was setting a boundary. Renee had already stormed upstairs, no doubt texting her friends about how insane I was being. Janet sat at the table, rubbing her temples like she was the one under attack. She's just a teenager, she muttered. She doesn't mean half the stuff she says. I shook my head. She meant every word, Janet. And you let her. That's the part one can't forget. She didn't apologize. She didn't even try to. She just said, I can't abandon my daughter. And that was that. I stood up, said, then pack your things, and walked out of the room. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the porch until sunrise, listening to the creak of the wind and the low hum of traffic in the distance. I thought about everything, about how I'd let this happen, how I'd turned my own home into a hostile environment just to avoid conflict, how I'd spent the final stretch of my life financing people who didn't give a damn about me. And I thought about my father, a quiet man who'd worked in a factory for 40 years, who died with calloused hands and a savings account he never spent. He used to say, there's no pride in buying love, it never lasts. I used to think he was just bitter. Now I know he was right. The next morning, they were gone. Janet had left a note, but I didn't read it. I didn't want apologies or excuses. I wanted peace. For the first time in 3 years, the house was quiet. No slammed doors, no passive-aggressive remarks, no disappearing funds. Just silence. And for once, it didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. They were gone before I made my coffee. The smell of her vanilla lotion still lingered in the hallway when I walked past the guest bedroom, which had, of course, become Renee's room the moment they moved in. Her bed was stripped, posters gone, closet emptied like they'd been planning it for weeks. Janet didn't say goodbye. No final plea. Just a folded note on the kitchen counter that I never opened. I didn't need to. Whatever it said, it wouldn't change the truth. I'd been reduced to a wallet with a wedding ring, and once the account dried up, so did their presents. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the empty kitchen, realizing how long it had been since I'd truly felt at home in my own house. I must have stood there for 15 minutes before I turned around and sat in the breakfast nook, listening to the fridge hum while the silence settled in like dust after a demolition. People assume the hardest part is the decision to cut someone off, but it's not. It's the morning after, when you wake up and realize you're finally alone with your own choices. There's no one to yell at, no one to explain yourself to. Just your own reflection in the microwave door, wondering if you were right to burn it all down. I spent most of that day cleaning. Not because I needed to, but because I didn't know what else to do. I scrubbed the countertops, vacuumed the baseboards, even wiped down the windows, which I hadn't touched since the day Janet moved in. It felt like reclaiming territory I didn't even realize I'd lost. Every time I passed by the guest bathroom, I'd pause, half expecting to hear her music blaring from behind the door. But it stayed quiet. And it was in that quiet that something started to take root, something sharp and hollow and oddly comforting. It wasn't joy. Not yet. But it was a kind of peace. Word got around fast. My friend Marcus called that weekend. He's known me since our early engineering days, back when we used to share an office cubicle and sneak bourbon into late-night project meetings. What the hell happened? He asked, already knowing the gist from a mutual acquaintance. I told him everything, about the ATM comment, the silence from Janet, the ultimatum, the exit. He whistled low and said, "Damn, you actually followed through." There was no judgment in his voice, just surprise. Most guys would have folded, he added. Hell, I probably would have. That was the moment I realized how many men in my shoes stay silent, stay married, stay miserable, just to keep from being alone. But I wasn't interested in being another cautionary tale whispered about at retirement parties. I was done paying for my own neglect. A few days later, my younger brother Sam stopped by. He's 10 years younger, never married, no kids. He's always been the blunt one in the family, the guy who says what everyone else is thinking but won't admit out loud. He brought over a six-pack and dropped it on the counter like we were back in college. "So, you finally grew a spine," he said, half laughing. "Took you long enough." I didn't argue. He wasn't wrong. I'd spent years trying to buy my way into a family, hoping that money could do what love couldn't. "You know," he said as he cracked open a beer, "you've always had a savior complex. First your ex-wife, now this. You keep thinking if you do enough, give enough, they'll suddenly love you back." I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. The truth was sitting between us like a third drink. But then he added something else, something I didn't expect. "You did the right thing. I'm proud of you. You finally chose you." That hit harder than I thought it would. I'd spent so long trying to be the dependable one, The husband, the provider, the fixer, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen as a person, not a role. The fallout wasn't just emotional. It was logistical, too. I had to untangle joint accounts, update beneficiaries, cancel scheduled payments I'd set up in Janet's name. Each call to the bank or the insurance agent felt like peeling off another layer of delusion. I hadn't just been generous. I'd been reckless. Love had blinded me. Yes, but comfort had numbed me. I had let things slide for the sake of peace, not realizing that peace built on silence is just a truce before war. The funny thing is, once the dust settled, I didn't miss them. Not really. I missed the idea of them, the fantasy I'd built in my head of a happy, blended family. But the reality had been far colder. I missed having someone to eat dinner with, sure, but I didn't miss the feeling of being tolerated. I didn't miss walking on eggshells in my own home, wondering if I'd said the wrong thing or spent too little or failed to read the room just right. I didn't miss being invisible. What I missed, honestly, was myself, the man I used to be before I started bending to fit into someone else's mold of what a husband should provide. By the end of the month, the house looked different, cleaner, calmer. The closets were lighter, the fridge emptier, the bills smaller. I started sleeping better, waking up without that pit in my stomach, that nagging dread of what new emergency would arise today that I'd be expected to solve with a swipe of my debit card. And in that stillness, I realized something that made me both angry and relieved. I had no one left to disappoint. And that, oddly enough, was liberating. The first Saturday morning after they left, I made pancakes for one. Real ones, too. Not the frozen kind I'd been heating up for convenience when the house was full. I mixed the batter from scratch, poured it into the skillet, flipped them slow and easy like I had nowhere to be. And I didn't. That was the strange part. For the first time in years, I had nowhere to be, no one to impress, no fires to put out. I sat at the table in my faded flannel robe, the one Janet always rolled her eyes at, and ate every last bite in silence. No one asking for almond milk instead of cream. No one texting at the table. Just me, my plate, and the sun coming through the kitchen blinds. It felt, holy almost, like a small, sacred moment I hadn't known I was starving for. What surprised me most wasn't how quiet the house was, but how natural the quiet began to feel. I'd always thought I was a man who needed noise, needed people around, needed to be needed. I used to imagine retirement as dinners with family, movie nights with grandkids, holidays full of laughter and leftovers. But what I got instead was entitlement and manipulation dressed up as gratitude. And when that was gone, I didn't miss the noise. It had never really been joy to begin with. It had been pressure, obligation, noise that drained more than it gave. Now, with just the ticking of the clock and the rustle of trees outside, I found myself breathing deeper, sleeping longer, thinking clearer. I didn't even realize how exhausted I'd been until I stopped waking up in fight or flight mode. I started going on walks again, the long kind that wind through neighborhoods and parks without a destination. I nodded at strangers, fed ducks by the lake, even bought myself a cup of that overpriced coffee I used to call ridiculous. Turned out, it tasted pretty damn good when you weren't buying it for someone who'd complain about the foam being too flat. On one of those walks, I ran into Deborah, a woman I'd met years ago through a community project when I was still working. She asked how I was doing, and I told her the truth, not the polite version. She winced when I told her about the ATM comment, but her face shifted into something like admiration when I added that I'd cut them off and kicked them out. Good for you, she said. Most men your age would have just kept taking it. We ended up chatting for nearly an hour. She gave me her number. I didn't call it. Not yet, but I kept it. It felt good to be seen as a man again, not just a wallet. About 3 weeks into the silence, I finally tackled the upstairs storage room. It had become a dumping ground for things Janet needed and Renee refused to part with. I found old makeup kits, shopping bags from stores I'd never set foot in, even an unopened laptop I'd bought for Renee that she didn't like the color of. I boxed it all up, every last bit, called a local shelter and arranged a pickup. As I watched the volunteers load the items into their van, I felt like I was exorcising something. These weren't just objects. They were physical reminders of every time I bit my tongue, every time I reached for my credit card instead of standing my ground. Letting them go felt like reclaiming my spine. The nights got easier, too. I stopped watching the news, too much noise, and started reading again. Books I'd forgotten I owned. Steinbeck, Baldwin, even a bit of poetry when the mood struck. I cooked for myself without feeling self-pity. I lit candles just because I liked the smell. I even fixed the leaky faucet in the guest bathroom, the one Renee used to complain about, but never once lifted a finger to address. It was funny how capable I still was, once I wasn't pouring all my energy into people who took it for granted. I found myself whistling again, humming while I made coffee, tapping my fingers on the countertops like I used to before the house got crowded with expectations. One night, about 6 weeks after they'd left, I found an old photo in my desk drawer. It was from my late 50s, before I met Janet, taken at a company retreat. I was laughing, genuinely, drink in hand, arms slung around Marcus's shoulder. There was a light in my eyes I hadn't seen in a long time. I stared at that photo for a while, letting the memory of that version of me rise to the surface. He looked free, light, whole, and I realized then that I didn't want the life I'd built with Janet back. I wanted that man back, the one who knew who he was without being defined by someone else's needs. I pinned the photo to my corkboard, not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder. I'd been whole once before. I could be again. Of course, not everyone saw it that way. My cousin Mary called me after hearing about the breakup, as she called it. She was just protecting her daughter, she said, as if that justified everything. I told her protecting someone doesn't mean enabling them, and it sure as hell doesn't mean sacrificing the dignity of your spouse. Mary clucked her tongue and said I sounded bitter. Maybe I was. But bitterness wasn't the poison I feared, it was apathy. And the fact that I still cared enough to feel anything meant I hadn't gone numb. Not yet. Not ever. I was hurt, yes. But I was healing. And healing, I was learning, can be loud in its own quiet way. And then, just as I was beginning to think they were gone for good, it happened. A knock at the door. 2 sharp raps. I peeked through the window and felt my stomach drop. Janet. And standing behind her, sheepish and uncomfortable, was Renee. I didn't open the door right away. I stood there, hidden behind the curtain, watching them on the porch. Janet was dressed like she always did when she wanted something. Muted tones, hair just done enough to look effortless, face painted with concern. Renee, on the other hand, looked like she wanted to be anywhere else. Her arms were crossed, her weight shifting from foot to foot like standing still for too long might crack the illusion that they had any right to be there. I took a deep breath, counted to 5, then opened the door, not wide, just enough to let the air between us feel real. For a moment, we all just stood there, the silence between us thicker than the summer heat. Janet offered a small smile, the kind you give when you're testing the waters. "Can we talk?" she asked, and for the first time in months, I looked her in the eyes and felt nothing warm rise up to meet her. I didn't invite them in. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. That, in itself, was a message. They'd left this home. They didn't get to walk back into it just because they were finally feeling the consequences of their choices. Janet looked like she wanted to protest, but didn't. She sat down on the porch bench without asking, and Renee hovered near the steps, arms still crossed, face set in that teenage grimace of discomfort. "I've been thinking a lot," Janet began, her voice low, controlled. "About what happened, about what was said, and I just want to say I'm sorry. I should have said something when Renee made that comment. I should have defended you. I didn't say anything. I wanted to see if she was going to keep talking or if that was the whole apology." She glanced at Renee like she was passing the baton. "And she has something she wants to say too." Renee sighed, audibly, dramatically, and then muttered something that sounded like, "Sorry." I blinked at her. "That's it?" I asked, not angry, just tired. She rolled her eyes. "I said I was sorry, okay? Like, I didn't mean it. I was mad. People say stuff when they're mad." Janet jumped in, trying to smooth things over. "She's been struggling. Things have been hard. Without your support, financially, things got tight. We've had to move into a smaller place. She's working part-time. It's been a wake-up call." I nodded slowly, letting it all sink in. "So you're here because life got hard," I said. "Not because you realized you were wrong, but because the money dried up." That was the first moment Janet's face cracked. She looked down, and for a second, I thought she might cry. But she didn't. She just said, I miss you. I miss what we had. I made a mistake. Mistake. That word. Like it was a wrong number dialed or a grocery item forgotten. Not a pattern. Not a betrayal. Just a little mistake. I took a step back and let out a slow breath. You didn't just make a mistake, Janet. You made a choice. I gave you a clear line, and you stepped over it. You didn't just let Renee disrespect me. You watched it happen. Repeatedly. And the second I cut off the money, you were gone. That wasn't a mistake. That was a decision. Renee shifted uncomfortably, but didn't speak. Maybe for once, she realized this wasn't her show to star in. Janet looked at me like she wanted to reach for my hand, but something in my expression must have warned her off. I wasn't angry anymore. That had passed weeks ago. What was left now was clarity. And clarity, I was learning, could be sharper than rage. We want to come back, Janet said finally. We want to make it right. Things will be different. I almost laughed. Not out of cruelty, just disbelief. Different how? I asked. Because you're broke now? Because you realized the ATM you married was also a person? She flinched, and I felt a brief flicker of guilt. But I didn't walk it back. I'd spent too many years softening my words for the comfort of others, only to be discarded when I finally said something true. I'm not the same man you walked away from, I told her. I don't want to go back to being someone's plan B. I don't want to be tolerated. I want to be respected. And if you couldn't give me that when the money was flowing, why would I believe you can give it to me now? She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. Just read this when you're ready, she said, placing it on the bench beside me. I know I have no right to ask, but I'm asking anyway. Then she stood up and touched Renee's shoulder, guiding her down the steps. They walked back to their car slowly, like people leaving a grave. I didn't wave. I didn't follow. I just stood there, envelope untouched, until their car turned the corner and disappeared. I didn't read the letter. Not that day. Not the next. It sat on the bench like a ghost, heavy and silent. When I finally opened it a week later, it was full of all the things I wish she'd said when we were still married. Regret, self-awareness, even some humility. But it felt like a eulogy read too late. The funeral was already over. I'd already mourned the marriage, the dream, the false sense of family. I didn't cry. I didn't get angry again. I just folded the letter neatly, slid it into a drawer, and went back to my coffee. Because the truth was, I was done. Not out of bitterness. Not out of revenge. But because I had finally understood that peace doesn't come from being needed. It comes from being respected. And I'd spent too many years chasing the wrong kind of love. The kind that only sticks around as long as the bank account stays full. It's been 2 months since they showed up on my porch with their half apologies and full expectations, and I haven't heard from them since. No calls, no texts, no birthday card, not even one of those performative social media posts that Janet used to tag me in when she wanted to show off how blessed she was. And yet, for all the silence, I don't feel abandoned. I feel intact, like I finally stitched up a wound that had been bleeding for years while I kept pretending it was just a scratch. There's something about choosing yourself that people don't warn you about. It's not glamorous. It's not some movie moment with theme music and a well-timed monologue. It's quiet. It's deeply, painfully quiet. But it's also the most honest kind of healing there is. I still keep the house tidy, though now it feels less like upkeep and more like care. I dust the shelves not because I'm expecting company, but because I enjoy the way the light hits the clean wood. I make my bed every morning. Not out of habit, but because it reminds me that the space is mine again. Mine and no one else's. The bed doesn't smell like someone else's lotion. The laundry isn't mixed with clothes I didn't wear. The fridge doesn't contain milk substitutes or clean eating fads I never subscribed to. Everything in this house is exactly where I want it to be, and I hadn't realized how rare that was until it became my daily reality. Peace, it turns out, isn't something you wait for. It's something you protect. With boundaries. With decisions. With distance. Sometimes people ask me if I ever think about taking them back. Maybe they've changed, a neighbor suggested, after she heard the story through the grapevine. But change without accountability is just a delay tactic. Renee didn't apologize to me. She apologized because she was broke and embarrassed. Janet didn't fight for our marriage when it mattered. She walked out when I stopped giving. That's not growth. That's opportunism. and I refuse to play that role again. I'm too old to gamble on people who only remember your worth when their lives fall apart. I spent decades building mine. My peace, my home, my finances, my dignity. I'm not lending it out to anyone who treats me like a temporary asset. I went to the hardware store last week just to browse. I didn't need anything urgent, but I ended up buying a new lock for the front door. Not because I was afraid of them showing up again, but because I wanted the symbolism. A clean lock, a new key, a way to say, without speaking, this chapter is over. As I screwed it into place, I thought about all the things I used to let in so easily. Criticism, guilt, manipulation dressed as family obligation. I thought about how often I'd open my door to people who didn't knock, who just assumed they had a right to walk in and take what they wanted. Not anymore. Now you knock. And even then, I get to decide whether the door opens. Last Sunday, Marcus came by again. He brought ribs from the barbecue place we used to hit up after work back in the day. We sat on the back deck, the smell of smoke and meat thick in the air, two old men talking about things that mattered. I told him about the letter Janet left, about how it was full of all the right words said far too late. He nodded slowly, chewing like he was processing every word. Closure doesn't always come from the other person, he said. Sometimes it comes when you realize you don't need them to say sorry. You just need them to leave. That line stuck with me. I hadn't realized how badly I'd wanted her to beg until she finally did, and I didn't care. Not because I'm cruel, because I was done. There's a part of me, maybe the part raised by stoic men who never talked about feelings, that still questions whether I was too harsh, whether I should have given her another chance. But then I remember that love, real love, doesn't require you to become less of yourself just to keep the peace. And I had spent enough time shrinking, making myself small to fit into someone else's vision of a husband, giving more than I had, laughing at jokes that made me feel like a nuisance, watching my bank account drop and my self-worth drop with it. No, I wasn't too harsh. I was too generous for too long. What I did wasn't cruel, it was overdue. A few nights ago, I lit a fire in the backyard pit and sat outside with a drink in hand. I stared into the flames and thought about everything I'd built over the years. Not just the financial stability, but the man I had to become to walk away from people I loved. Or at least, people I thought I loved. There's something sobering about realizing you were in love with a version of someone that only existed in your hopes. But that clarity is also power. It means you can stop chasing ghosts. It means you can stand still, breathe deeply, and say, this is enough. I don't wish them harm. I hope Janet finds her peace, and that Renee figures out who she is without someone footing the bill for her mistakes. But I also hope they remember me, not as the man who gave up, but as the one who finally said, no more. I was never just the ATM. I was the structure, the foundation, the one who held it all together while they kept tapping the walls to see if they could find a weak spot. And when they finally did, they thought they'd collapsed the whole building. What they didn't realize was that I'd already started drawing up new plans. One that didn't include them. Sometimes the hardest thing you'll ever do is choose yourself, and keep choosing yourself when the people who once used you come crawling back. Have you ever had to walk away from someone who only saw your worth in dollars? Share your story in the comments. I read everyone. And if this story hit home, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps me keep telling the real, raw family stories that too many people are afraid to say out loud. See you soon in the next story.